Exactly 3 years ago, I was in the middle of a spiritual journey looking for the absolute truth. As I said in the previous video in this series, I eventually came to realize that Christianity didn't possess this absolute truth, so I continued to look elsewhere. However, about a month prior to my conversion to Islam, a question sprang up in my head. What if the truth isn't in any religion? What if the truth is that there's no true religion? What if the truth is that there's no God? Now, I was still heavily leaning towards theism, but given that I was trying to put every religion up to the test, I decided to entertain the idea anyway. And so I went down a rabbit hole trying to rationally prove God's existence, and well, the rest is history. In this video, we're going to explain that very history and explain why I rejected atheism. But before we begin, first I just want to give a huge shout out to the Thought Adventure podcast. They are a Muslim YouTube channel that use their rational faculties that Allah gave them to come to the rational conclusion that He is true, that He exists, and that He is one. I actually found the channel through a semi-famous Islamophobe, funnily enough, who was a guest speaker on the channel in one of their episodes. Truly, Islamophobes do a fantastic job at guiding people towards Islam. Anyway, I spent countless hours watching their content and trying to wrap my head around the material, which, to be honest, is a little bit high level for me. I eventually was able to reach a point where I objectively knew that there was a God, and I was able to explain why. And to prove that to myself, I wrote a document, one in my notes app, where I pretty much just went through the entire process, going from zero to arriving at theism. And it is that document which we're going to go through in today's video, starting now. But real quick, one more thing. I want to apologize for anyone who did see my previous YouTube video in this series and thought that I was a little bit arrogant. That was not my intention, and I don't try to come off that way. I'm just simply confident in my stance on this topic, and I hope that I will not make the same mistake in this video. Number one, there are two possibilities as to how we got here. Either our universe has a beginning or it's eternal. If it's eternal, that means it has no beginning. It has always existed. However, there's a logical problem with this. If you start at zero and try to work your way back to negative infinity, you'll never reach negative infinity. Similarly, if you start at negative infinity and work your way forward, you'll never reach zero. In other words, if the universe had no beginning and started infinity ago, we will never reach this point that we're at now. This is a point that I mentioned in a previous video in this series on why I didn't choose other religions. In that video, I briefly tackled atheism.
You cannot have the universe come into existence without God. And the way that atheism tries to explain how everything came to be without God, they have some very senseless ways of explaining things. You have the infinite regress, which basically says the universe is eternal. The universe has always been here, or that this universe was created by another universe, which was created by another universe, which was created by another universe, and so on and so forth. Basically, you have an infinite regress of things that cause things that cause things that cause things, and that's how we got here. But the thing is, you can't have an infinite regress, because if you were to imagine the timeline of reality to be like a row of dominoes, something has to push that first domino. You can't have a row of dominoes just fall and fall and fall and fall forever and ever and ever and ever. Something has to push that first domino, and the thing that pushed that first domino is God.
And I know there's probably an atheist watching this who's saying,
okay, but then where did God come from? Who created God?
well, the answer to that is simple. What's north of the North Pole? Nothing, bro. The very definition of the North Pole is that it's the northernmost point on Earth. You can't go north of the North Pole. And similarly, the very idea of God is that He is the uncreated being that created everything. You can't go before God. It's an illogical question.
Not only that, but you cannot have something come from nothing.
So yeah, basically right now we're in the year 2024, and if the universe is infinite or eternal, then that means that it started in the year negative infinity. In order to arrive at the year 2024, we would have had to traverse across an infinite number of years to get here, which is impossible. So that's how we know that the universe or existence as a whole is finite. Number 2, whatever created the universe has to be a necessary being. That means that we cannot imagine an existence without this entity being present. And if everything that is contingent came from this necessary being, that would mean that the necessary being is eternal. It has no beginning or end. Basically, there's 2 types of beings. You have contingent beings and you have necessary beings. A being whose existence relies on another being is contingent, while a being whose existence does not rely on anything else is necessary. Since we said that there had to be something that was there in the beginning to push that first domino, that very thing has to be necessary. It is eternal and perhaps not even bound by time itself. It is the creator of time. It's possible for a contingent being to exist or not exist. However, it is not possible in any possible reality for this necessary being that always existed and always will exist to simply not exist. Number 3, the necessary being not only has to exist in all realities, but all of the attributes of this being are necessary as well. The necessary being couldn't be any other way. In other words, the being is perfect. On the other hand, a red triangle necessarily has to have 3 angles because that attribute is explained within its definition. But its color is contingent because there's nothing in the definition of a triangle that states that it has to be red. So yeah, basically contingent beings can exist in different types of ways. How they exist is contingent as well. It can vary. However, the necessary being has to be the way that it is because it's necessary. All of its attributes are necessary. And if you were to change any of its attributes, even a little, then it would no longer be necessary. Really, there's no other adjective that you can ascribe to such a phenomenon other than perfection. I guess that's a noun, but number 4, if the entire universe came from this necessary being, that means that the being is omnipotent or all powerful. If we can cause these giant explosions just by splitting atoms, then you can imagine that a being that's capable of creating a universe full of atoms has to be omnipotent. But who's to say that there's not more than one necessary being? I mean, couldn't there be 2 or 3 of them? Well, in the previous video, I did a thorough job at explaining why polytheism is logically impossible.
If there's 2 gods which are all powerful, then they're not all powerful, because all powerful implies you have power over everything. But if God number 1 is all powerful, he would have to have power over God number 2. And if God number 2 is inferior to God number 1, then God number 2 is just not God. So you can't have 2 all powerful beings. That's logically impossible. The other thing is that God is a perfect being. If you had 2 perfect gods, then conceptually those 2 gods would collapse into one God.
Now, what is a perfect being? A perfect being is one where if you were to change the being even a little bit, then that being would no longer be perfect. It is perfect the way that it is. To give you an example, let's say you have a triangle, a perfect triangle. This triangle has some attributes such as its shape, its size, its color, its position, and its rotation. If you were to change any of these attributes even a little bit to make the triangle different, then the triangle would no longer be perfect because it is perfect the way that it is. Now, when you introduce a second triangle, it has some attributes that are different. It has a different color, a different shape, a different size. The second triangle is not perfect because it's different from the first one. In order for the second triangle to be perfect, it would have to have the same shape, the same size, the same color, the same position, and the same rotation. But at that point, the second triangle and the first triangle would conceptually collapse into one being. Even if you had 10 triangles or 30 or 100, then they would all have to be the exact same, and they would all conceptually collapse into one triangle. And so to apply this idea to God, and God being a perfect being, there really conceptually cannot be more than one God, because the multiple gods would have to be the exact same and would conceptually collapse into a single being. There cannot be more than one God, and they're perfect beings, and they're also different at the same time. And if you were to say that, oh, well, then the gods would not be perfect, then, well, they're not God.
And this is also why the Trinity in Christianity is impossible. The three persons or hypostases within the Trinity would conceptually collapse onto one another and end up being one being in the end. At that point, they would be the exact same. There would not be any distinguishment. And yet, according to the Trinity, they say that the Father is not the Son, which is not the Holy Spirit, which implies that there's a difference going on here, which would then mean that either one of them is God and the other two aren't, or none of them are God. I didn't go down this route in my video on Christianity because I had the foresight to know that if I did try to go down that route, I would be met with the "it's a mystery" card. So I just chose to make a satirical skit out of that.
What you thought this was? You thought you was about to get me with your logic? No, I'm a Christian. We don't use logic. We just believe.
Number 5. We also know that this necessary being has a will of its own and chose to create the universe. If it didn't have a will, then it would be like a mechanical force. Fire is hot from the beginning of its existence to its end, not because it chooses to, but because it is hot by its nature. Similarly, if this necessary being didn't choose to create and instead it was in its nature to create, then it would create from its beginning to its end. But since this being is eternal, that would mean that it would create eternally. We know that this is not possible since that would result in an eternal universe. And as we said before, an eternal universe would result in us never progressing to this point in time. Since we know that everything began to exist at one point, that means that the necessary being went from not creating to then creating, which means that it acted on its will and made a choice to create. And if it has a will, then it has a mind and intelligence. This necessary being that is perfect, eternal, singular, all-powerful, and intelligent is what we define as a God. A finite cause will lead to a finite effect, but an infinite cause will lead to an infinite effect. If it's in the necessary being's nature to create, like it's just a mechanical force that just creates without any actual will going on, and if this being also happens to be eternal, then this act of creating would just eternally happen, would result in an eternal effect, which is an eternal universe, an eternal creation. Again, we already explained how that's logically impossible. As far as the idea that the God has intelligence, I actually talked about this in the previous video.
Is God intelligent? You know, there's some people who say that God could just be this force that created everything. The force doesn't really think, it just kind of does. The thing is, whenever you look at the world around you, you see intelligence. You see a creator that isn't just a force. It's a creator that intentionally put things the way that it is. A more tangible example would be the fact that this microphone right here is picking up my voice and is Bluetoothing it back to this camera. It would be really absurd, crazy, stupid even, for you to say that over the course of millions of years, this was created by a bunch of dust just smashing together in a certain way to where, boom, now you have the microphone. This piece, the little clip, the little plug-in right here, the light, all of it was thanks to some dust just crashing together. This microphone was obviously created by someone who has some intelligence. It was created by a designer who intentionally designed to be the way that it is. Now imagine how much more complex is my ear. You know, the microphone is able to pick up on my voice, and so is my ear. The ear can also pick up on the voice. For you to say that even the camera was created by dust just smashing together. Obviously the camera, when you look at it, you can see intelligent design. How much more complex are my beautiful eyes?
Deism is the belief that there is a God, but this God either doesn't care about us or this God can't care about us. Well, I mean, the second option, that the God can't care about us, has pretty much been debunked now, given that we said that the God does have an intelligence and a will of its own. So it definitely can care about us. But the question is, well, just because it can doesn't mean that it does. So does it? Number 6, we know that everything eventually degrades into chaos over time. However, all of mathematics, physics, and the laws of the universe are consistent across all of space and in time. However, there's nothing that states that these laws have to stay consistent. They could very well degrade into chaos like everything else. However, we don't see that to be the case. We can infer that it is the God who upholds and maintains the universe. This means that the God, at the very least, cares about the universe on a macro level. So yeah, basically, the speed of light could very well change. And no, I'm not talking about how the speed of light does change whenever it goes from passing through one medium to another medium. I'm talking about just in one medium. This is not something that we see. We see that the speed of light, in fact, is a constant. You can infer that it is the God who is upholding these laws and preventing them from degrading to a state in which the universe is unable to continue to exist. Number 7, we also see on Earth how intricate and complex life is and how everything is in order. All of the cycles and systems on this planet in the ocean, atmosphere, and land, as well as the ecosystems and even within the organisms and their cells, have order. It is illogical to say that this world and all of its order came from random chaos. At the very least, this means that the God put very particular detail into creating our world and is aware of our existence in the universe. I also went into this topic in a previous video.
When you look at, how the earth was made, you look at all the green and the animals and everything, like, they want to tell you that order came from chaos. Everything in the universe tells us that everything that's in order will eventually dissolve into chaos. You never have it the other way around where chaos turns into order. And yet they say that a bunch of rocks smashed it together in such a way that now we have the earth. Like, what? It doesn't make any sense. It completely goes against everything that we know. Specifically talking about the animals, how did life get here? How did the animals get here? How did we get here? They say evolution. And I don't have a problem with the idea of animals mutating over millions of years. That's not the issue. The issue is, how did that start? What was the first life? Was it single cell bacteria? Okay, where did that come from? They want to say aliens. Okay, where did the aliens come from? You have to answer that. Where did the first life come from? And what is life?
I should mention before moving forward that I'm not making a case for the fine-tuning argument. I don't want to use the fine-tuning argument because I find it to be a problematic argument, given that its basis is on modern day scientific understanding of the universe. These numbers that the fine-tuning argument gets, such as 10 to the negative 40 whatever, right? These are numbers and information that we understand in today's world, information that could very well change in 100 years and is different from the way it was 100 years ago. I mean, just look at how many times the model of the atom changed. I do believe as a theist that everything is fine-tuned, but I just don't believe in using the fine-tuning argument in its current iteration to express that belief. Number 8, we know too that the God has given humans consciousness and rational faculties. Consciousness cannot be explained by materialism and the natural physical world. If the God gave us this consciousness, one can infer that the God cares about us specifically as well. From here, we can infer that the God cares about how we live our lives and has a purpose for us. Okay. Hold up. I'm kind of tired of saying the God over and over and over. So I think I'm just going to translate the God to Arabic and just say Al-Ilah. But I'm not going to lie, saying Al-Ilah is a little bit of a mouthful too. So I think I'm just going to take Al-Ilah and just kind of mush it together and just say Allah. What? What are you making that face for? The word Allah is used to refer to this God, this necessary being, not just in Islam, but also in the Tanakh and also in the Bible. I'm not really using the word from a religious perspective, but rather just from a linguistic perspective. And I think from that perspective, we can still be on the same page and use the word without feeling like we're dipping our toes into something a bit prematurely. Don't worry, I'm not trying to impose my Islamic belief. yet. Now, regarding this last point, science can only explain the consciousness up to a certain level, with all the neurons and the hormones and the brain waves and blah 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 blah, right? But science can't explain why consciousness feels the way that it feels. Science can't explain how we're able to have subjective experiences. And yeah, this is known as the hard problem of consciousness. But if consciousness cannot be explained by the natural world, then that would mean that it doesn't come from the natural world. And if it doesn't come from the natural world, then it has to come from the supernatural world. And that would then mean that it would come directly from Allah. And if Allah gave this consciousness to us humans, us small, insignificant humans, then that would mean that yes, Allah does indeed care about us small, insignificant humans. And we can infer that Allah does care about how we live our lives. The document from which I've been reading stops here because honestly, once I came to the part of this document, I remember feeling this, like my throat just began to kind of choke up at like the idea of like, oh my God, like I have it, it's here. Like it just clicked. Like, wow, like I can't deny it. Becoming Muslim was something that I could no longer put off, as I had been doing for so long up until that point. The very next day was whenever I became Muslim. Anyway, by this point, I have used logic to prove that there is a perfect, eternal, intelligent, all-powerful, unique being that necessarily has to exist in all possible realities, exists outside of space and time, created space and time, is the origin of all life regardless of whether or not you believe in evolution, and directly gave us humans the rational faculties and consciousness to experience creation and bear witness to the unique existence of its creator, who we refer to as the God, or in Arabic, Allah. I am fully aware that there are a million more questions that you can ask regarding this topic. I'm also fully aware that the questions that I did answer in this video, honestly, I did not go nearly as deep as I could have. Others have already done it anyway, so I'm just here to explain my story. Sorry, it is what it is. If I had to give one piece of advice to anyone who is sincerely looking for the truth, that piece of advice would be to simply let go. And what do I mean by let go? On one extreme of the spectrum, you have people who blindly believe in whatever they believe in. People who are very dogmatic with their faith. You can't tell them nothing. Like, they're just firm, dead set on what they believe in. They are not open to any criticism of their own belief. That's one extreme. But then you have the other extreme of the spectrum. This is a common thing nowadays here in the West, something that's growing, possibly due to the rise of academia. It is the overly analytical, overly critical, and overly skeptical view that they have of pretty much everything. They are cursed by their self-inflicting inability to actually be open to the truth because of how critical they are of accepting anything. Analysis is good. Criticism is good. But these things, like most things in life, need to be used in moderation. That's why there's a middle path between the two extremes, where you're not just blindly following all left and right and being all dogmatic, but you're also not being overly critical to the point where you're just putting yourself in a loop where you're just asking questions and asking, oh, what if? Okay, what about this? What about that? And to the point where you're not actually going to go anywhere. And so that's why I say that at the end of the day, you just sometimes need to just let go. There's a guy that I know. This is funny. He was like this. He would ask so many questions about everything and would constantly dig himself into holes. And he was honestly trying to, seek out the answers to things, but he just was so stuck in his own head that he just could not see the truth right in front of him for so long. He wanted to be like 110% certain about everything. 95%, 90%, nah, like you need to be 110% 10% certain that this is it before you make an informed decision. This was his mentality. He was worried about, like, what if he jumps into something that he would regret later on. He wanted to understand the mechanics of everything, and he would ask questions that honestly were completely irrelevant to anything, you know, such as, if Allah existed forever before creating the universe, what was he doing? And, you know, it's just like, this guy, this dude that I'm referring to is, of course, none other than yours truly. I was the little guy on the canvas wondering what the artist was doing before he painted me. The fact that I even went down the rabbit hole to begin with, trying to logically prove Allah's existence, is nothing other than a detour towards ultimately becoming Muslim. But I'm not trying to tell you to blindly jump into anything. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I reached a point eventually where there's certain things, certain details within the Islamic faith that I just accepted without needing to know the backstory or the reason behind it or the textual evidence, because by that point Islam already had a pretty good track record for just being the truth. And no matter how many times I tried to put it to the fire and put it to the test, Islam always seemed to come out on top and have an answer for everything. And when a religion has an answer for everything and has this type of track record that is building over the course of a few months, and then beyond that, whenever after I, you know, became Muslim and they continued to just do the same exact thing for me, I just realized, well, maybe there's just no point in trying to be so critical. I mean, you still want to be critical, you still want to ask questions, but at some point, again, you just need to let go and just realize this thing has a pretty good track record. Let me just kind of let it do its thing and just believe in it. If you agree with everything I've said in the video, you're really left with two options. You either declare that you do believe in Allah, or then you don't, and you just choose to reject it despite not disagreeing with any of my points. And then at that point, then maybe I'm not the one who's being arrogant here. Maybe it's someone else. Once you arrive at the objective truth that Allah exists, then you're left with this immense pressure of wanting to know why he created you and what your purpose is here. And again, this is a topic that I touched on heavily in my agnosticism video. Honestly, it took up half of the video. In that video, I kind of left it more open to you to explore the 4,000 different religions and to go on your own quests. However, I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to spare you the trouble and simply say that over 90% of world religions are polytheistic, but we've already debunked polytheism. That only leaves you with the monotheistic religions. And as far as those go, some of them I did tackle in my video on why I didn't choose other religions, maybe not as well as I wish I would have. Two particular religions that I did tackle pretty hard, that being Christianity, and then of course, because Judaism shares the same book, or at least the majority of it, yeah, I kind of tackled Judaism too. So what religion are we left with then? When it comes to the conclusion that we logically arrived at in this video, Islam is the most compatible with that conclusion. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. I really appreciate anyone who is still watching up until this point in the video. Given that the next video in the series is going to be on Islam, do be sure to leave any comments asking questions about theism with regard to the context of Islam, or just questions in general. You know, if you have any counter arguments, be sure to leave those in the comments as well, as respectfully as possible. Subscribe, go ahead and leave a like.